We are live. I am really excited to welcome Mark DiMassimo to the show today. Mark is the founder and creative chief at DiMassimo Goldstein or Digo, and just an all-around great guy. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Mark, to tell us what's on your mind.
What's on my mind? Thank you. First off, it is really an honor and a pleasure to be here on Twinning Strategy. I've been watching and listening and loving it. So it's wonderful to be here. But I'll tell you what's on my mind in a word is ownership. I am obsessed with ownership right now. The promises of ownership that people buy into when they start something, whether it be a Main Street, bistro or a startup, or whether they're next generation inheriting, or whether they become the partner of something. I'm obsessed with what people dream of, the promises of ownership, and the reality of most owners' lives, and the gap between those two things, and what can be done about it.
So when you said ownership, I was wondering whether, is he going to talk about the angle of owning your company or owning what your company does? Because we're talking about, using the market for good. Like, there's the sort of, there's the more concrete ownership, and then there's a more metaphoric ownership. Do you think about those two things as two sides of the coin, or?
Well, first off, I love that. I love the kind of thinking that you're doing, because I think I like the idea of thinking about this concept of ownership in the most expansive way possible. And I think if you want to experience the full dreams of ownership, then you need to think about it in the most expansive way possible, so that you don't just own the equity, and you don't just own the profits. You also own the impact.
Right.
Both intended and unintended, and on and on and on. And how this connects for me, we're DIGO, we're the Positive Behavior Change Agency. I believe that people who think like owners in that expansive way, who have both that level of responsibility and vision connected to what they do, whether they be small business owners, founders, or brand owners inside of larger businesses, those who really think like enlightened owners have so much power to change things for the better in the world. And so I'm channeling more and more of my positive behavior change efforts through owners.
So I have a question for you, Mark, on this subject. I think it's kind of fundamental American dream. I am the owner, right? This is the concept of ownership. So if it's so fundamental to our society, what could possibly stop people from wanting to do it, and what gets in the way?
Elena, I don't know your ethnic or national background or whatever. Do you know what the number one ethnic group is of American entrepreneurs?
No, I don't.
Russian.
Russian, yeah. Well, I am
ethnic Russian.
It's kind of interesting, but I would imagine it is people who are first generation. I am first generation, right? And one of the things that attracts me about the construct of this society is very much the ability to own something and be something. And it's just this idea of ownership is fascinating to me.
I think we don't it always seem to go that we don't know what it's got till it's gone. People who were raised up or raised by people in a society where entrepreneurship and ownership was a blocked path value it really highly. Those who grow up in a society where the assumption is you can live the American dream, you can become an owner, you can start a business, you can get anywhere, they naturally question it. My goal is to reintroduce them to it as if it's the first time.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that you say this. So I'm actually, as you're talking, I'm thinking about like Eric's and my, background. So both of our grandfathers were on both sides. Let's just say we have the same grandfathers, but both of our grandfathers were entrepreneurs. One grandfather basically built his father's basically a cobbler shop all the way to this very large shoe store business in the up in Massachusetts. And then our other grandfather at one point was he actually was a designer of plaids, but also had a business at some point called Stitch and Knit, which was a sort of like a sewing business and whatever, but had that sort of entrepreneurial spirit. And I think in some parts of our family, that sort of entrepreneurial spirit has really continued. And I think for me and Eric, like we've just come to it a little bit later, but it's really interesting how that, like if I look at my cousin, who just sold after many, many years. She built a business, sort of placement agency for, for like speech and occupational therapists and so forth. And on the other side of the family, we have, the continued ownership of shoe store businesses and so forth. So there was like this entrepreneurial thing that sort of, at least in our part of the family, maybe sort of skipped a generation, but here we are, both of us, again, trying to figure this out and coming to it late. But it definitely is sort of a different, experience I'm finding trying to sell myself, even as a marketer. Like it's like I'm super passionate about what I do and what I'm talking about, but the part of like trying to figure out how do I get somebody to buy it is sort of this fascinating, like, how do I compromise? What do I want to do?
It is. And we have thoughts, so I've got some pretty specific and organized thoughts about that. First off, it's no wonder it felt when the first time we talked, Jeff, like we're speaking the same language. Both of my grandfathers were entrepreneurs, had their own businesses. Both of them were born in the U.S. Both were born in Massachusetts. Both lived as babies in Italy and then were sent back as teenagers. One was a clothing designer, ended up with a clothing factory in New Jersey and a clothing business. The other, a hairdresser with a couple of hairdresser businesses. I grew up in those businesses, watching the entrepreneurial life. I saw my father as an engineer working for GE, trying to start things on the side with some success, but never enough to get out of the corporate world. He liked being an engineer, but as a result, every few years, he had to go live away from the family for 6 months when he started a new job in another city.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw both sides, the entrepreneurial life, the struggles of it, but also, as I say now, for me to get fired, 15, 16 people have to fire me in the same day. Okay. Right. I have 15, 16 bosses. I'm not my own boss, really. Right. In an agency.
So Mark, I'd love to get into this concept of using marketing for good and positive behavior change. I think that's a really, really interesting direction. I'm not sure how many people would equate marketing and, sort of for positive change, but clearly that is something that can be used for. How do you think about that? How do you is it how you choose the companies, or is it how you pitch to companies? Is it some combination of the two?
Thank you. Great question, Eric. A lot of marketers don't really like it when I talk about positive behavior change, because it points out an uncomfortable fact that the thing we do changes minds and behavior. And so if the behaviors they're marketing are not behaviors one would be proud to market, they don't like me using this language.
Right.
So for me, it started out with let's call this what it is. We change people's behaviors. That's how we measure our results.
Right.
We do that by changing their minds and also by changing their path, the environment, the user experience that they go through in order to create default choices that are better choices and to help them. So I just said, what happens when you start to take full responsibility for not only how you do what you do, but also the effect of what you do? And one of the first things that came up was that has got to be a criteria on what will sell. The impact. Is it helping people or not? We do work for not-for-profits and, have long-term commitments with not-for-profits, but 99% of what we do is for profits. I believe you can be in a for-profit business that has a positive effect on the behaviors and the life through the behaviors of the people who you serve. And that's why I tend to gravitate toward healthy, wealthy, and wise type businesses. We do a lot of that kind of stuff. But
do you have to filter out? I mean, obviously there's this concept of greenwashing and it's counterparts in other areas. But I don't know, greenwashing is the one that comes to mind. Is like, you have to filter out the companies that are saying, oh, look, all this is, I mean, I guess the classic is the oil company that says, yeah, we're doing all this stuff in clean coal or whatever it is. Like, how do you have to filter those out?
We are emphatically not one of those purpose agencies. That's fine. There's a place for that. And if companies actually absorb the purpose all the way down deep into their central mission, then great.
Yeah.
But that we're the opposite about that. If that's the personality ethic, as Stephen Covey used to say, of like, oh, let's be more acceptable to people by wearing a purpose on our sleeve. We focus on character. Like, what is the core of what you're marketing to people? And do they buy you because they want to change their lives for the better? And then does it really help? Do you take it beyond the initial sale to actually helping them get that promise out of it? Whatever that promise is. And if you're not that, we're not interested. So yes, we've heard from, tobacco companies and from oil companies about stuff. We're not in the business of taking money from companies like that in order to have them do a minor thing and make them look good. If they fundamentally want to change behavior for the better, we're open to listening.
So do you, Mark, an interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking, do you also find that when you do work with companies that just because they are sort of thinking through the lens that you all think, that they actually become sort of even more focused on doing good because they work with you all?
Yeah, I think so. But it's by no means a given that just because a company hires us, they suddenly start thinking our way. Any more than it's a given that just because a company buys your product, they're thinking your way. They liked the promise, or they're not. And by the way, that promise of positive behavior change, people will search that on the internet and then call us, which is really nice. But then they hire us and suddenly we're their agency. Right. And it's on us to make sure the experience we give them keeps on redirecting them back to that promise. Because first off, when you have your people thinking we're changing behavior for the better, they're more motivated.
Right.
Secondly, if you're thinking that way, you're less likely to make the mistake of just spending enormous amounts on acquiring new members or customers or whatever, only to just let them languish. Right. To think of CRM or customer experience or whatever, just as something that doesn't actually add value. It adds a lot of value if it gets people out there in the world saying, they're changing my life. I wouldn't live without them.
So I have a question. Ultimately, every for-profit business wants to measure themselves on top line, bottom line, share, or a combination, right? In this case, they have to add a KPI. And the KPI is, I changed the consumer behavior positively, right? How do you instill that in fundamentally numbers-oriented business people?
Could you help us with that, Elena? We have a we have an index that we have been developing over the last 3 years, which is a positivity index, and we've been tracking it against publicly available macroeconomic and public company data for those 3 years, and we back tested it as well, and we can use it to pretty much predict the cycles of effectively cost of incremental market share
Wow.
based on this positivity score. It's kind of too deep to get into it right here, but we have a positivity score. We've been able to correlate it to survey data, which we use, and we use those surveys in order to guide client decisions. We, being an agency, we're more focused on guiding client experiences than we are in publicly launching, our version of the Dow Jones Industrial Index. So we haven't done it yet.
Mhm.
But it exists, and we've been watching it for 3 years, and it's a very real thing. Positivity is correlated with cost of share growth.
Wow.
That's
Do you do A/B testing of like, okay, here's the positive message, change the behavior for the positive versus, whatever, more typical, just buy our stuff kind of advertising? And are you seeing in those A/B tests that same?
Yeah, we do an enormous amount of testing. Back in the day, I was a social science, probably not surprising now, social sciences major, and all of that, who just got entranced by advertising early on. And I started in direct marketing at BBDO Direct, working for Ed Nash. So, right from the beginning, I was this integrated, person, because I didn't have a marketing home. I didn't study marketing.
Right.
But I love, I'm the son of an engineer, as I said, I love the scientific method, love the testing. And we do. Here's how positivity works. There are different levels of what we found. First off, do you do your job? Like, whatever I buy you for, do you do it? That is the first level of positivity. We all know there are loads of categories where there are lots of competitors that do the basic job really well, right? The next level is, do you make me better? We're in a transformation economy now. Do you make me better? So do you do your job? Do you make me better? And the third level, which, by the way, is where most of these greenwashing campaigns are happening. This is the third level. It's actually irrelevant, or only relevant in a small way to most categories now, is, do you make the world a better place?
Right.
So we actually test within those buckets in order to get our experience right.
That's fascinating. So it's interesting. I was I was having a conversation with someone last night, and I was thinking about this is somebody that I worked with at the Hershey company, and I was using as an analogy for something too complicated to go into, but what the problem with healthy chocolate. So we were always, like, at Hershey, was always trying to come up with healthy chocolate. And the problem with healthy chocolate is that people don't eat chocolate because it's healthy. And so what the point I was trying to make was, the problem with healthy chocolate is you don't make anyone healthier if they don't buy it, right? Like, you can make it healthier or whatever, but if nobody is interested in it, you've actually not accomplished anything. And I think that's sort of an interesting challenge that you sometimes see, is companies are trying to, they're looking at like, how do I solve this problem that my brand has, or what my brand does isn't perfectly good on some dimension, and they try and solve that problem in a way that basically goes so against the category that it doesn't work. I don't know if
that's a great story. This is why just having positive intentions, this is why they need marketers, because marketers know how it works. And you're right, the first job of chocolate is to be a break from all those dutiful things, and to be the best possible tastiest break from it. So Hershey's needs to do its fundamental job really, really well, or else they can't compete in that category. Can you be a positive part of people's lives if you're providing something that isn't there for help? I certainly think so. I think Hershey has been.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think Hershey does a ton of great things. And I think, one of them is just, I think some of it's just recognizing like, what is the thing that you do for people, right?
Yes.
Otherwise I mean, well, we know this as marketers, like if you're just talking about something and it doesn't make any sense with the brands, nobody believes you. And it doesn't really affect any change at all. So it's just I guess it's sort of like an astroturfy approach to marketing.
It's a pandemic though of people doing that because they feel they've bought into a simplistic view of who the new consumer is, and that they just want to hear about what nice things you're doing, and they just forget the relevance and the specificity and diligence that we bring. That's why we have analysts. That's why we have strategists. That's why we have planners. It's why we do research, right? It's all that.
So, go ahead, Elena. Sorry.
Just a quick question. So, Mark, in your view, what categories actually do a good job at it?
This is a great question. So, not necessarily just because these are categories that do a great job at it, but also because you can't develop expertise in every category. And yet, as a creative agency, focusing on just one limits what we're best at, right? Which is creativity. We need to be able to see the connections and learn across. So that's why we focus on healthy, wealthy, and I would say probably self-empowerment. So I say wise, but it's education, entrepreneurship, and stuff like that. But I think to help most people out in your audience, I would say that the greatest examples are in the categories where you wouldn't expect it. When Nike was founded by somebody who really did want to empower runners to run faster with better shoes. So it was baked right into that initial DNA, but Nike did something I don't think they set out to do from the beginning, which was massively change our culture to make us more mobile, to get more people exercising, to make it a part of the American culture, and now a global culture that didn't exist in the early 1970s. Right. It just didn't exist. Nike did that, and all they were trying to do was sell shoes.
So I have a question about generational differences, because at least, for everything I read, and, we're, Jeff and I are in Gen X. I don't know where you guys all fall, but
I'm a young boomer,
kind of in the middle, right? And so there's definitely this, at least from everything I read, like there's definitely this sort of like, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, millennials are much more interested in this doing good, doing well by doing good kind of thing. Is that an experience that you have in your creative and advertising and marketing work, or is that just kind of the popular culture just decided that that's what they want to talk about?
Did someone say uh-oh?
I think Jeff may have.
Oh, Jeff froze.
I did, because I lost everybody first.
Yeah,
I'm good. Go ahead.
That was such a good question. It froze Jeff for a second. That's how good it was. I
shouldn't have said uh-oh. I mean, it sounds like Eric's question.
Why are you asking?
Well, I was a little kid in the 60s, and I studied political science. I wanted to do good, and I ended up in advertising. And at the time, I felt like it wasn't a tribe that cared about the same things I did, but it was a tribe with the same DNA I had in many ways. But the generations may be different, but back to we work with an organization called Rosemark, and they have a process called QP where we segment buyers by why they buy. And what we find is that the whys, back to that, do your job. We find that the whys cut across demographic, age cohorts, and all of that. That the segments, we've gotten now back segmentations from 3 different clients across 3 different categories. And in one case, all of the segments are demographically the same. And yet their reasons for buying are as all over the map. And then we have another one where there's no correlation at all between, age cohort and reasons for buying. Mm-hmm. So while there are differences in the generations that sometimes make news and sometimes become acute, in culture, when they're driving marketing and buying decisions, you got to take it all with a big grain of salt.
I always feel like life stage, I think, tends to have more of an impact than age or when you grew up or whatever, at least in my experience.
Lifestyle, life stage, absolutely.
This keeps happening to me. I had a question and then it goes right out of my head.
That's all right. I can
your mainframe now. It's happened to your mainframe.
Jump in and
I can ask mine while you're thinking. Is there a correlation with a level of emotional maturity in wanting to do good?
Wow, we could spend a half hour on that. And where I go is that that it could be depending on how you define wanting to do good, it could be either correlated or inversely correlated, in the sense that I think that there are emotionally immature folks of all ages out there who imagine a world where everybody can neatly be organized as good or evil. And so they're highly motivated to not be seen as evil and to be seen as good. And therefore they're highly motivated to be involved in things that look like they're doing good, and afraid of the murky middle and the pragmatic conversation. So emotionally immature, high desire to be involved with things that they believe look good. I think really wanting to do good and really being able to stick that through the difficult analysis of how you really can do it, that takes emotional maturity.
And very interesting.
So I remembered my question. So Mark, I've noticed that you have been talking a lot on LinkedIn and so forth about smaller companies. And I think that's probably, sort of takes us back to the whole ownership point, whatever it is. Where do you see the opportunity from a sort of this, positive behavior change, sort of marketing approach for these smaller companies who often are just trying to get the next sale because they need to keep the lights on, whatever.
Well, that's a great place to start. People start companies. They have they inherit companies and they have a dream, and then they immediately are treading water, trying to keep their heads above water. And when they try to figure out how to fill up their sales pipeline or how to market, they are increasingly inundated with their LinkedIn inbox and their email inbox full of fly-by-night new specialist agency and sales warming offerings. They don't know any of you. They don't know any sages who can help them filter and find what the right things to do, the right people to do it with. They are absolutely overwhelmed and stuck. And I feel for them. I really do. And I think when I walk down Main Street, that most of the people behind those doors that look so bright and shiny are just barely making it.
Yeah.
And so there's so much we can do for these people. The first thing we do when we work with them, we started this thing called the ownership. The first thing we do is we light up their LinkedIn and their email in such a way that they're booking a lot of sales meetings. so that I call that the engine room. It's a ship, the engine down below. The second thing we do is work on that big brand idea, the legend, and I call that the wind in the sails.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing they get is a navigator, somebody like me or you, who really knows how do you market, how do you build a brand. Once or twice a month, hour-long meetings where it's a navigation call, we call it.
Mm-hmm.
And you get it like a creative gift every month. That's it. But it turns out that's all they really need. And they go from depressed people, visibly depressed people, to people who are optimistic again, standing straight. It's a beautiful thing.
That's awesome.
Hey, Mark, fantastic discussion. It is amazing sometimes how fast this half hour goes on Fridays. Would love to keep the conversation going, but we probably need to wrap up. And so what we usually do is go around and give one thing that we want to either leave the audience with or one take home or whatever. And we always throw our guests to the wolves first and give ourselves more time to think about what we want to say. So Mark, you're up. What would you like to leave the audience with?
You know, I'm a big believer in emotion and focusing in on emotion. And what I walk away with is this revelation of gratitude of spending time with my tribe of real marketing thinkers, you know, that there's just, we wrestle with a problem. Why do people do what they do? And we wrestle with it in different ways together. And for me, I always learn and it's always great. So that's what I take away.
Jeff, you want to?
Awesome. Mark, before I give my 2 cents, what's the best way for people to connect with you or with Digo?
Mark DiMassimo, D-I capital M-A-S-S-I-M-O. Just look for me on LinkedIn. I'm an open connector, and I don't read a lot of the bots stuff that comes to my inbox. But if you connect with me, I'll connect with you, and we can see what each other do. I think that's the best thing. DigoBrands.com if you want to learn more about the agency, but LinkedIn's the best place.
Awesome. I guess for my takeaway, I love your point about ownership and the stuff we were talking about at the very end there about how small businesses obviously resonates with me trying to start something here myself. And I just think you're absolutely right. I think there's lots of just opportunity for people to sort of get out of that day-to-day, like I'm just trying to survive, and back to the dream that sort of got them to start the business. So I love that idea, and I will pass it over to Elena.
Thanks, Jeff.
So for me, a fascinating point was that the change of behavior for good could be driven by very complex motivations that are not necessarily, all clear cut. And it's up to us as marketers to figure out the scale and scope and act accordingly.
Great.
Well said.
So my take home, I really find that Nike story really interesting, and just the concept that there doesn't need to be, it's not either you're doing good or you're marketing. Like that's not an actual dichotomy. And it's kind of cool. The Nike story is really cool in that they just kind of fell into actually this, really positive brand space. So that's fantastic. Well, thank you all. As always, a pleasure to do this on a Friday afternoon. And Mark, thank you for joining us this week.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.